Thank you for having me here today. It's a wonderful joy to be here today. So today I'm coming to you all as a young adult with cochlear implants. For just a little bit of background information, I received my first cochlear implant just shy of 2.5 years old and was activated at age 3. So if we understand language acquisition and language development, that's a really important consideration there. I also faced a revision surgery in my lifetime, which is actually coming up this next week. Is my anniversary of my revision surgery. It has been 20 years, and I received that revision surgery when I was 10 years old, as I had an adverse experience where a soccer ball hit the side of my head and broke my internal device. So all the considerations, and this is the point I like to make, with all those considerations in mind, I've been a CI user my entire life, and through different adverse experiences and life experiences both, I have faced numerous mapping changes. I actually asked my audiologist recently, and she went back in her database. I have over 2,000 cochlear maps in my lifetime. So next slide, please. So young adults with cochlear implants, who we are. Now, this could be a bit of a broad group, but when we think about a young adult with cochlear implants, the majority of us have been implanted pre-linguistically, which means that we were implanted before our language development window was complete. But for the sake of this survey and this group, we also consider young adults with cochlear implants to be children who are implanted under the age of 18, because we understand that across the world, there's different experiences and different cultures and different barriers of access, with access to be able to access cochlear implant technology. Next slide, please. So I'm very thankful for this team. So if you are looking at this chart, this is the chart that has been pulled from the 113 respondents of the cochlear implant survey that were young adults. So children who were implanted under the age of 18. The point that I really would like to make with this chart that I really appreciated from Sue and their team is if you look at the numbers, if you look at that age group 11 to 20, it's a mix of, I say, is the first generation of children who were implanted young, and the second generation of children who are implanted young both. And if you look at 0 to 10, those numbers are going to keep growing. And then if you look at ages 21 to 30 and then 31 to 40, because I do have a couple good friends who are 35 and they fall right on that line of also being one of the first children implanted very young as well. But I like to really put this point here because if you look at this, even if 21 to 30 and 31 to 40 looks smaller, but you can see that the data that this group is growing. And this is so important because we have to start recognizing that young adults with cochlear implants like myself, we're the first generation. And we have very diverse lived experiences. And that's what's been very cool with both the group that we're a part of and the survey, because it brings us to this really important point. Next slide, please. Your current generation of pediatric cochlear implant users are your future young adults with cochlear implants. And I plead with you. One of the biggest things that I typically find just with the people that I mentor and children I mentor, your pediatric audiology practices and cochlear implant protocols fit only for earlier intervention, but I rarely see that they actually are appropriate for school-age children. And I often sometimes see that young children are pretty much put into adult cochlear implant protocol. But is that what is appropriate for us as people who are young adults with cochlear implants throughout our entire lives? Next slide, please. And this matters because for so long, when we think about cochlear implant technology in terms of deciding, upgrading, determining the services, we typically look at research where it's 0 to age 5, which is kind of that earlier intervention category. And we have some school age, but I feel like the data isn't there. And then we jump into data, and truly, when I look at the data, especially in the States, I'm seeing over age 50 related to adults with cochlear implants. And the way that you learn to listen to a cochlear implant is completely different. On top of that, we are the new stakeholders for this entire group because we haven't just lived with cochlear implants through our whole life, but we have faced numerous technology changes, numerous upgrades, numerous naps. And it's so interesting when you think about just all the lived experiences that we have from different backgrounds and different stuff. One of the number one things that we talk about over and over again is we feel like we've been left behind. People get so focused on implanting children at a really young age, and then helping adults who have lost their hearing, which is super important for adults who want cochlear implants. But what about the generation in between? Next slide, please. So we did a small survey within our advisory group, which we will be putting a declaration for later. And I ask y'all to be on the lookout for that. We're super excited and we're working behind the scenes on that. But from this, I have pulled just the summary of our responses. And what I have here is the top 2 responses. So just for full disclosure, our group is 10 people total. And as you see, the #1 response on our survey was declaring our group as young adult CI users as the primary stakeholder group that the world needs to support. Because of all of our lived experiences, we understood, and we can talk about the journey of when we were implanted young. We also have the experiences of what it's like to be an everyday CocoaPoint user as an adult. And then the second point that I like to observe and also state is there's a lack of understanding about the needs of our everyday life. Because for different situations, especially in my case, since I was implanted pre-linguistically, so before my language window was developed, I rely on additional support than an adult who may have heard with their hearing their entire life, already have the neurobiological mapping and natural brain tendency in order to hear. And you have to look at us as 2 different people. And it's unfair to us to assume that an adult with cochlear implant that has cochlear later in life is going to be the same as a young adult like myself, because our experiences are very different. Next slide, please. So if you're really thinking about the reality that young adults with cochlear implants face, I just am going to put this slide up here just to allow you guys to read and everything as well. But this is a really super important point, because one of the things that we face as a young adult with cochlear implants is several of us actually consider ourselves culturally deaf, or we're more into our deaf identity because of several of us were born with hearing loss or acquire hearing loss at a very young age, and we're part of this community and culture. And one of the things that we have talked about in the group over and over again is that merging of that deaf identity with cochlear technology, and a lot of us wrestle with that, which is a very fascinating thing to think about. So for us, being an adult user who's a young adult with cochlear is also identity as well. And this is where I like to highlight this point, because of those experiences. And when we talk about into the light of disability rights and everything, we always talk about that you should support a disabled person, correct? And so often people don't view that disability rights is actually a life continuum of services and supports. So this was one of the things that was observed in our group, and these are quotes from the survey that we did with our group and the overall survey as well. And we're going to really talk about the healthcare piece in just a minute. So next slide, please. So one of the biggest things, just like I said earlier, most of the time what we typically see, especially in the States here, and other friends of ours have shared, you get all the services when you're really young, and then you age out really fast. And then you may get services later in life, but it's not the same quality of services that you received when you were younger. Because if you don't have language, there's so much focus that our rehab is built around our language, which that's a whole nother lecture and presentation. We know that. But this is some very big quotes that we pulled out, and that these quotes really meant a lot to me and resonated with me as a young adult with cochlear implants, just from the lack of access and the extensive costs that young adults with cochlear implants face, myself included. In the States, audiology services are not covered, upgrades are not really covered, and most of everything comes out of my own pocket. And that's hard for me as a young adult with a job, who's starting out a new job and everything. And can you imagine that for somebody who's trying to have a family as well? So there's different costs. So we talked about this a lot, that, people get cochlear implants later in life and face experiences way later in life when we've already been facing them through our lives. Next slide, please. And this quote really resonated with me, and this came from the global survey that everybody did. I will have cochlear implants all my life. I should have support for them all my life. Next slide, please. Because I want people to start thinking, we as young adults with cochlear implant users are a stakeholder group, but the reality is lifelong cochlear implant service are a human right for people with cochlear implants, especially young adults with cochlear implants myself. And we must be considered, and we must be invited to the table when you're talking about policy and everything, because we bring the experience of being a child who was implanted young and living through our whole life and transitioning into becoming an adult who wears cochlear implants as well. So thank you guys, and we'll answer any questions in the chat.